Welcome to Ames Public Library, both in person and online, for this program, which is part of the 2024 History Lecture Series, brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and Ames History Museum. I'm Kathy Cooney, an Adult Services Librarian here at APL. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like tonight's event. For those of you here in person, this room has an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. To use this, just switch your hearing aid to T. I will also have an assisted listening device in the back that I can lend you if you want to come talk to me about that. For those of you with us virtually, please submit your questions through the Q&A or chat function, which is linked at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll make sure they are shared with our speaker. We've also enabled live captioning, which you can enable on your device by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. For all of our participants, today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the History Museum's YouTube channel after the event. You can also find the link to that video and a list of suggested reading related to the theme if you want to learn more at amespl.org/historylectures, which I'll also place in chat when I get to the back. We will have time for questions at the end. If you're on Zoom, as I said, please put them in chat. If you're here in person, we ask that you ask them into the microphone so the folks at home on Zoom can hear you. And we'll have Alex going around with the microphone to give everyone a chance to ask their questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Savannah.
Hello, I am Savannah, Office Assistant with the Ames History Museum. I want to welcome you to our lecture series program tonight, and hello to everyone watching online. We are so happy to have this great partnership with Ames Public Library and to be able to provide the lecture series in this hybrid format. Be sure to pick up one of these lecture cards over on the table with the dates for the remaining lectures in this series. The Ames History Museum is a small nonprofit organization doing a big job with limited resources. We want to once again recognize and sincerely thank those in the audience who are currently members of the museum. This faithful annual support provides essential funding for our day-to-day service to the community and our ability to preserve archives and artifacts for present and future generations. If you are not a member and would like to become one, please feel free to pick up a membership form or go online and become a member today. The museum is currently closed for expansion, but museum staff and volunteers are still hard at work on research requests, exhibits and programs, and preservation of Ames history. We look forward to welcoming you to the expanded museum later this year. In the meantime, check out our website, ameshistory.org, for more information about the expansion and upcoming events. Now, I would like to welcome our speaker for the evening. Kathy Svec is a longtime volunteer with the Ames History Museum and currently serves as the newsletter editor and lecture series coordinator. She researched and developed this program for the first 10 churches established in Ames, telling the rich and varied history of these early congregations. Please join me in welcoming Kathy.
Okay, let's see if this microphone works. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, very good, very good. I think we'll be off and running. So the early history of church congregations in Ames is rich and varied and indicates the strong need for spiritual fulfillment sought by our pioneer settlers. Even though the congregations subscribed to different religious philosophies, there were many common challenges and triumphs as the churches grew and expanded. So these are the churches that I'm going to be talking about, 10, established between the early 1850s and 1916. These were all Christian organizations. Now, if there were Jewish or other groups in town, we have not yet found that information. This presentation is mostly about the physical church buildings and is not meant to be a lesson on comparative religions. Kathy, can you dim the lights a little bit on the screen? So we're going to start first in the early 1850s with the Ontario Church of Christ. In the early years of Ames, there were a number of smaller nearby settlements. As Ames began to grow, these towns became incorporated into the city limits. New Philadelphia was founded in 1856 and was south of what is now Ontario Road and west of North Dakota. But the little village maintained only a very feeble existence. In 1869, the railroad constructed a depot near New Philadelphia and laid out a new town named Ontario. It was west of North Dakota Avenue and north of Ontario Road. New Philadelphia was later merged into Ontario. Now, Ontario was never fully incorporated, but it did have a one-room school, grades 1 through 8, located at what is now 1701 North Dakota Avenue. Ontario also had a post office, barber shop, 2 churches, a general store, and the reliable feed mill that still stands today. Ontario was annexed by Ames in 1962. In the early 1850s, the Ross and Beadle families arrived in Story County, and Ames residents will recognize that name, Ross, on Ross Road, and Beadle also is the name of a street. So they arrived in Story County and provided the foundation for the Ontario Church of Christ, known as the New Philadelphia Congregation. The meetings were held in homes and then in a schoolhouse, but the organization was rather tenuous. In 1865, another effort to organize resulted in ordained elders and deacons, but when the lead person left, the congregation scattered. They kept trying, though, and another effort occurred in 1871 and 72, but by this time, the village of New Philadelphia had been renamed Ontario. Over 50 people gathered, and with this support, a church building was put up in 1872. Here it is. In 1882, J.H. Painter provided oversight, meetings were held, members were active, and ministers engaged. In 1912, a larger building was needed, so the congregation remodeled and rebuilt, resulting in a, quote, convenient and pleasant building, unquote. Church work took on new life, and a minister took up the lead for the next 4 years until 1916. In the museum's holdings is an annual report from 1919 listing 41 members. But I'm sorry to tell you that I don't have much more information than that. Although as Ames grew, Ontario diminished. So I assume that church activity shifted to congregations in Ames. So now I'm going to jump back to 1855, and we're going to talk about the Pleasant Grove Community Church. Pleasant Grove Community Church is a still existing non-denominational church in Milford Township, northeast of Ames. Church services were held as early as 1855, about 10 years before the city of Ames was established. And it existed in a little brick schoolhouse that no longer stands, but used to be just east of the current churchyard. The congregation was served by circuit riding Methodist preachers. In 1873, 50 nearby families agreed to take on the task of building a church. The founding families include well-known Story County pioneer names: Sowers, Soper of Soper's Mill, Smith, we have a road named after the Smiths, Hughes, Cooser, Kegley, and Randall. T.R. and Eleanor Hughes deeded land to the church trustees for $25 in December 1877. The site was surrounded by woods and was known as the Little White Church in the Oaks. The woods near Skunk River provided easy access to firewood, and a cemetery was located right next to the church. Pleasant Grove was known as the most modern church in Story County because it was the only church that had a stable to protect the horses from the weather during meetings. Now that's modern. A church member later commented that it was interesting to read that it was such a modern church at one time because modern conveniences they did not have were running water and indoor plumbing. Because of the proximity to the cemetery, congregations could not dig a well. In the early days, to get to church, you'd walk, use a horse and buggy, ride horseback or mule, or if there was ice, you could skate on the river. In the winter, Abner Nash would stop by farmhouses and pick up the smaller neighborhood children in his sleigh, putting warm bricks in the sleigh to keep their feet warm. The ministers came from far distances, and they were met in Ames at the depot on Saturday with a horse and buggy. The first depot in Ames was built in 1865. Families would take turns boarding the ministers until Sunday evening or Monday morning, and then take them back to Ames to meet the train. A pump organ was purchased in 1884. Wooden pews were hand-hewn with the backs and seats cut from one piece of wood. In the back sat a pot-bellied wood stove with a pipe running the length of the church, up over heads to the front where it joined a pipe of another stove before reaching the chimney. In the winter, the choice seats were not the pews underneath the stovepipes. Members chopped and hauled the wood for the stoves. The church was the center of many community activities, ice cream socials featuring hand-cranked ice cream, sleigh rides, and theatricals. There was a good choir, speakers would come for an evening, and an old-time revival meeting was held lasting for 2 weeks. In 1886, the congregation discontinued its relationship with the Methodist Church, becoming non-denominational. From 1911 to at least 1921, a social group met as the Pleasant Grove Country Club. In 1914, the Pleasant Grove Orchestra was organized and played for the church and the social club. An Epworth League for Youth was in place for at least 20 years. The church was very active until World War I, when it was closed for 7 years. It opened again in July 1925, having no services since the flu epidemic of 1918. Starting in 1927, for 15 years, a homecoming association organized and met annually. Friends would return for all-day meetings, and past ministers came to speak. The congregation dwindled in size, and due to the Depression's hard times, the church closed again in 1933. In 1939, the church again opened. Boy, they just kept trying. Members collected money and pledges of labor to restore the church's original appearance. The interior was cleaned, repairs made, and in 1940, a basement was dug by hand. And finally, electricity was installed in September 1941. The church continued until into the mid-1950s, when the pastor's health failed and the church was again closed. It reopened in 1960 with a new minister who served for 5.5 years. After that, services continued with part-time ministers until the pastor at Gilbert agreed to serve, staying for 4 years. In 1964, the church's float in the Ames Centennial Parade featured 3 of the wood pews and the old church pump organ. In 1967, a new altar was built, a gas furnace was installed, and the church continued to be served by retired ministers, students, and lay preachers. Improvements always kept the original charm of the old country church. In 1968, there were 20 to 30 people attending Sunday services. In 1973, Pleasant Grove Church celebrated its 100th year with a well-attended full day of activities. In 1977, the church was refurbished again and listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2010. Sunday services continue to this day on a monthly basis. Now we're going back again to 1855, and we're going to talk about the First Baptist Church. Before Ames was established in 1864, a group in the area known as the Squaw Creek Church met for worship. The pastor was Reverend Ira Reese, a Baptist mission minister who moved to Story County in 1855. He was appointed to serve both Boone and Story counties. Busy guy. There was no church building, so the meeting place after 1862 was the one-room Hoggett School, located on the east bank of Squaw Creek. In 1860, the small group joined with other area churches to form the Upper Des Moines Association. In 1862, the association met in Father Sparks's barn near today's Ledges State Park. Reverend Reese said, quote, "We are now laying the foundation upon which future generations are to build, and we hope to lay them in the right direction. We request each member to do something each year for missionary purposes, unquote. Reverend Reese, after suffering hardship and poverty, moved west to try to establish another settlement. Without a leader, the church faltered until 1867, when the Upper Des Moines Association reported Squaw Creek is again put on the list with 19 members. Many of those in the Squaw Creek Church appeared later on the membership rolls of the First Baptist Church in Ames. In May 1868, Reverend Childs, the Iowa Baptist State Convention Secretary, drove from Oskaloosa to Ames. He was joined by Ames resident K.W. Brown, the son of a New York Baptist minister. They took on the task of reorganizing a church. Brown was the grandfather of Ames historian Farwell Brown. Brown and Childs went out from Ames looking for Baptist families and found 5. Soon after, an announcement was heard that, quote, the Baptists will hold a prayer meeting this afternoon at 3 o'clock in the rear room of the building occupied by Frank Hayes' harness shop, unquote. 8 people met that Sunday afternoon and decided to form a church. On July 11th, 1868, 8 charter members signed the rolls of the First Baptist Church of Ames. By October 1868, there were 23 members, and the church joined the Upper Des Moines Association. Laymen sustained the operations until January 1870, when Reverend Mitchell became the first resident pastor. When Reverend Mitchell started, the 30 members had no place of their own to worship. The congregation rented the second floor of a building near the southwest corner of 5th and Kellogg. About that building, it was said, quote, it is a tall building exposed to the winds which threaten it so much it must be braced at the sides with timbers, unquote. Sounds a little breezy. In June 1872, K.W. Brown bought 2 lots on the northeast corner of 5th and Kellogg and gave the land to the Baptists. A wood frame church was built that year, paid for in cash. The spot is currently the parking lot south of the Methodist Church. As membership grew, plans were made for a larger church. When the old parsonage was sold, the proceeds went to fund a new building. In 1908, that new building was built on the same site as the 1872 church and cost $18,000. The dedication was held May 22nd, 1910. I love this picture. The Baptist church is there on the corner, and just to the left of it is the Methodist church. And then just to the left of that is the Congregational church. So there was quite a cluster of worshipers right in this area. In 1949, the church site and the 2 houses north of it were sold to the Fairway grocery store. Ha ha! One of the houses, the one immediately south of the Methodist church, was their former parsonage. And you can see that that house is up on stilts and is in the process of being moved. And it's kind of hard to imagine that Baptist church looks so substantial. There it is, a pile of rubble. In 1950, the First Baptist Church congregation moved to their 3rd church building at 200 Lynn Avenue, where they still are located today. In a fun footnote, when First Baptist marked their 150th anniversary in 2018, they held a service at the restored Hoggett School in a nod to their the very first building that they used for their gatherings. Okay, now we're going backwards again to 1865, and we're going to talk about the first Congregational church. In 1863, a Sunday school was organized by area settlers as a union assembly, again using Hoggett School. That was now located on the north side of what is now Lincoln Way. Now, buildings, you may know, in this time period were never wasted or knocked down if they could at all be saved. So Little Hoggett School was put up on jacks and moved a little ways away from where it had been at Squaw Creek. In 1864, meetings were held at the school at somewhat regular intervals. Preachers who initially led worship were among the first Methodist circuit riders, and the pioneer Presbyterian preacher, Reverend Isaiah Reed of Nevada, came about once a month. In December 1864, our city was platted by the railroad and named Ames in honor of Oakes Ames of Massachusetts, who was one of the largest stockholders in the railroad company. And in 1865, the railroad actually arrived in town and a depot was built. There it is. It's located on the site about where Dutch Oven Bakery is now, just a little bit west of Duff and south of Main Street. In the fall of 1865, Reverend John White of Woodstock, Connecticut, came to Ames. He preached to about 50 people in the railroad depot, where a buffalo robe was thrown over a dry goods box for a pulpit, and planks were placed on nail kegs for seats. After the service, Sunday school was overseen by Station Master H.F. Kingsbury. A movement had already begun to build a Union church. Encouraged by Reverend White, Mr. Kingsbury hosted a meeting in November 1865. Attendees resolved unanimously to organize the first Congregational Church of Ames. Charter members were 3 Congregationalists, 3 Presbyterians, and 2 Baptists. Mr. White moved to Ames in December 1865 to serve as pastor. On Christmas Day, 1865, a meeting was held at Alexander Duff's home to organize a corporate society to hold property and transact business. A constitution was adopted containing 14 articles. Among the first member names recorded were Henry May, who was the teacher at Hoggett School, K.W. Brown, again, Farwell Brown's grandfather, William West, who was the first mayor, and W.W. Fitzpatrick, who was the superintendent of the college farm. The Constitution was amended 8 years later to strike the word male from the membership requirements. See, those Congregationalists were progressive from the very beginning. At the 1865 meeting, a building committee was appointed. They proposed a 30 by 40-foot building, and member R.B. Shearer offered to build it for $300. Cynthia Duff influenced the railroad to donate 2 lots to the church, plus a gift of $300 cash. During construction, in order to save $12, Mrs. Duff, with other ladies, primed the sashes and puttied the glass in the windows. On September 12th, 1866, the structure was ready. It was the first church building within the city limits of Ames and was dedicated October 6th, 1866, barely 2 years after the city of Ames was platted. Cynthia Duff brought the communion service from her hometown of Syracuse, New York. It was used for 36 years until 1902 and is still proudly on display in the church. Other Syracuse gifts were the pulpit Bible, hymnals, and a plush covering for the pulpit desk. The pulpit was made at the college and paid for by college friends. In 1867, a church bell was given to the church by Oakes Ames as a tribute to having the town named for him. A parsonage was built in 1875. And that bell is still in the tower and is rung on a regular basis. In 1883, additions to the structure included an alcove for the choir behind the pulpit, an entrance hall, and a graceful spire for the tower. The Ames pastor also served the church in Gilbert. The church continued to grow, and in 1888, a 20 by 30-foot Sunday school room was added to the east with large folding doors into the main room. In 1896, Reverend Paul Douglas arrived as pastor, and the church felt the need for a larger building. On March 18th, 1900, the new building, costing about $13,000, was dedicated. It was built at the same location as the original frame church. Additions in 1930 included a larger sanctuary, an educational wing, and relocation of the parlors, dining room, and kitchen. After the 1957 national merger of the Evangelical and Reformed Church and the Congregational Christian churches, the Ames Church adopted the name United Church of Christ Congregational. In 1958, the education wing was expanded and a minister's study room was added. In 1963, a campaign was launched to purchase a pipe organ. And in 2003, the congregation added an elevator in a tower that perfectly matches the old building. Okay, now we're going to go back to 1866 and we're going to talk about the First United Methodist Church. And I know we've got the church historian here in the room, so I hope I'm not going to make any bad mistakes. The village of Bloomington was founded in 1857 in what is now Northeast Ames, near what is now Stagecoach Road. Bloomington had a Methodist church and a school that operated until right after World War II. The school remained standing until the 1980s when it was demolished. As a matter of fact, pieces of the school were salvaged to restore Hoggett School in 1981. In 1865, Ames first appeared as a preaching location on the Bloomington Methodist Ministers Circuit. The small picture is the 1866 Methodist Chapel in Bloomington. Kind of a tiny little place, but at least it was a place. In 1866, the Ames Building Committee and Board of Trustees were appointed. The organization was incorporated, and in October, the first church was built for $1,700 on the northeast corner of Onondaga and Kellogg. And hopefully you know Ames history enough to know that Onondaga Street was renamed Main Street. So whenever I say Onondaga, just think Main. Railroad man John Blair again donated the land. Now, the consignment store, the Loft, is now on the site where that Methodist church, where that Methodist church was built. And this is a very rare and very old photograph of that block on Main Street between Douglas and Kellogg. But you can see the Methodist chapel there in the red oval. This bird's eye view of Ames from 1875 shows the wood frame Methodist church located at the corner of Kellogg and Onondaga. The Baptist church was located at the intersection of Kellogg and Fifth Street, and the Congregational church was located at the intersection of Kellogg and Sixth Street, which is why Kellogg was sometimes known as Church Street in the early years. Until about 1868, Ames, Bloomington, and Pleasant Grove continued to be serviced by circuit ministers. The Ames Church had its own assigned minister starting in about that year, 1868. In 1884, the congregation purchased 3 lots at 6th and Kellogg for $650. In 1887, ground was broken for a church costing $10,400. And the congregation from the Christian church bought the first little Methodist frame building for $200 and moved it to a new site. Now, I mentioned how buildings were reused. So there's a little theme that's beginning to develop about all these portable churches that spring up and then are moved here and there. This early Methodist building, especially the picture on the lower right, some of the folks around the museum call this the Cat in the Hat Church. 19 years later, in 1907, a farewell service was conducted, and the wrecking committee raised the church to make way for the current church to be built on the same site. The cost was $53,400 in 1907. It was dedicated the next year, 1908. And the original plan did not call for a dome, but the contractor agreed to build one for $1,000. That church would be so different if it didn't have a dome. A pipe organ was installed in 1910 for $10,000. The Methodist 1908 building is a form of church architecture known as the Akron Plan. The layout is in contrast to the more traditional cruciform footprint and is characterized by a sanctuary with sloping floor and seats arranged in a semicircle rather than straight rows of pews. This provided an unobstructed view of the centrally located speaker. Classrooms were arranged along the back walls at both the main floor and balcony levels with easy access to the central sanctuary space. At the back of the main floor, sliding wooden doors could be opened to provide additional seating. Overhead doors in the balcony could be rolled up or down to accommodate worshipers or Sunday school classes. In the winter, when attendance was low and heat conservation important, a huge panel could be cranked down from the attic to reduce the size of the sanctuary. And that big panel has been removed. Quite advanced thinking in terms of ways to efficiently use that building. The sanctuary accommodated seating for 1,500 on 2 levels. For many years, the Downtown Methodist Church provided the largest auditorium space in Ames and was also used for college functions. A dual lighting system allowed for gas and electric lights from the same fixtures. In 1950 and 51, the altar, choir loft, and kitchen were remodeled and the organ refurbished. In 1955 and 56, a first phase of reconstruction occurred with the 2-story education addition on the east side. 1957, a second phase of reconstruction remodeled and redecorated the basement and sanctuary. And in 1964, the choir loft was enlarged, double pulpits were installed, and a south parking lot entrance was completed. 1968, a uniting conference for Evangelical United Brethren and Methodist churches resulted in the name change to First United Methodist Church. In 1980, a 38-rank, 1,368-pipe Casavant Freres organ replaced the smaller Hilgren Lane. In 1984, handicapped accessibility arrived with the installation of an elevator. In 1997, the church bought the land just to the south of the church, occupied by the former Fairway building. The structure was sitting in between 2 city parking lots. You might remember that. Interestingly, that parking lot land had once been owned by the church, but it was sold in 1948 to Fairway. After buying it back, they used part of the old Fairway building and rented the rest. Eventually, a land swap was negotiated with the city that consolidated the split city parking lots and provided space for the church addition, which was dedicated in 2013 after 2 years of construction. Methodist parsonages were built in 1881 and in 1893 immediately south of the church. After selling the one south of the church to Fairway in 1949, after selling the parsonage south of the church to Fairway in 1949, one was established at 1102 Burnett, and in 1963, a second one was located at 1321 Burnett, where they currently remain. I always thought the Methodists did a really nice job with that addition. Harmonized quite nicely with the older part of the church. Okay, we keep zigzagging back and forth in time. We're going to go back to 1887, and we're going to talk about the first Christian church. In an undated excerpt from First Christian Church's history is a statement mentioning the, quote, first new member received by baptism, unquote, and that the helpful Baptists had loaned their baptistry for the services which were often held at the river. In 1887, the newspaper reported that the Christian church people had purchased the lot immediately west of the city hall at 5th and Kellogg and would move a smaller structure that had been built by the Methodists to that location. So here we have those portable churches again, moving it from the corner of Main and Kellogg to the corner of 5th and Kellogg. A Sunday school was organized in March 1888 with 39 members. The first full-time minister served from 1890 to 1892 when 40 more members joined. By 1894, there were 175 members, and in September, the congregation dedicated a new church building at the northeast corner of Fifth and Burnett, the former location of Matisse Motors and currently Triplet Insurance. There were so many at the dedication that the crowd had to be accommodated at another church. First Christian's original little church building, hear this, was bought by the school board. And later it was sold for use as a carpenter shop. And once again, portable buildings, nothing wasted. The new church at Fifth and Burnett measured 40 by 62 with 16-foot high walls and a full basement. 2 corner entrances were capped with towers, one containing the church bell that was later placed in the third church at 6th and Clark. The building had stained glass windows, oak pews, and a fine rostrum. There was space for a library and the choir. The cost was $5,200, not including the value of donated labor. By 1906, the congregation numbered 357. Cost was, 357. This allowed the group to provide the pastor with a parsonage and a barn located at 718 Clark. In 1907, the church had become crowded, so plans were developed for a 36 by 40-foot addition on the east side. It housed a kitchen, dining rooms, 3 basement classrooms with a lecture room and 4 classrooms on the main floor. By 1913, however, the church was deep in debt, $4,000. A fundraising rally was held, and by early January 1918, 5 years later, the debt had been paid. A joyous burning of the debt notes backfired, however, because they could not later prove that one of the amounts owed had been paid. Yikes. Big mistake. I really like this picture. Far over on the right-hand side, you can see the dome of the First United Methodist Church. And you can also see residential houses on either side of the church. So all those blocks and those neighborhoods immediately north of Main Street were at one time residential housing. So this picture has a lot of information in it. On October 2nd, 1927, the First Christian Church celebrated its 40th anniversary by laying the cornerstone for its new church at 6th and Clark. In the cornerstone was a copper box that contained local newspapers, city and college telephone directories and maps, and church photos and documents. In June 1928, the congregation assembled at the old church for a farewell service, then marched to the new church's unfinished auditorium, followed by lunch served by the church ladies. In spite of pledges for the building fund, the congregation was $40,000 in debt, and much remained unfinished. Remember, this is the late 1920s. During the Depression year of 1932, payments on the principal and interest could not be made. The temporary tar paper roof needed replacing. The minister's salary could not be paid. The windows were covered with boards. When the minister left in 1932, volunteer preachers were taken on and paid only their transportation. A merger with the Baptists was considered. But the members got to work, volunteers did much of the finished work, and funds were raised through a statewide campaign to pay on the debt. In 1934, a new minister gave new life to the church, and a plan was developed to provide free Sunday bus transportation to Iowa State students. Very progressive idea. In 1934, the church's tinted glass windows came from the St. Joseph Art Glass Works of St. Joseph, Missouri. Church members did the work of setting the pre-cut pieces into the window frames. The glass company supplied 300 pounds of Wolf's special putty for the job. By early 1935, things were improving. Sunday attendance was up, pledges had increased, membership was up, and a women's council had been formed. By 1944, the burdensome debt had finally been paid off. By the mid-1940s, 450 college students were indicating preference for the Christian church, but the church was reaching only about a quarter of that. Those students were active in the choir, Sunday school, and assisting with Sunday worship. By the 1950s, the student group was serving their own Sunday suppers, sponsoring a foreign student, entering a float in the Visha parade, doing outreach services, and serving as deacons every 5th Sunday. During World War II, the church sold bonds for the war and for debt retirement, and the Service to Service People Committee sent cards, books, and religious literature to members and their families in the military. By 1945, membership numbered 400. In 1944, a new organ was purchased, extensive repairs were made on the church, and by 1946, the sanctuary was finally finished. Remember, they started this in 1927. 2 nurseries were conducted during morning worship in addition to children's church. In October 1947, 20 years after the cornerstone was laid, new pews and chancel furniture were dedicated. Membership stood at 774. In 1968, the Ames Community Preschool Center was established as the first nonprofit child care center in Ames. The First Christian Church offered use of its space. The child care center expanded to use 3 church-owned houses immediately adjacent to the church. When ACPC moved to their new building in 2013, the space at the church was taken over by Food at First, a food pantry and food recycling program that was located originally at the First Methodist Church. Okay, now we're going back and forth in time. Now we're going back to 1899. Prior to November 1899, the spiritual needs of Catholics in Ames and at Iowa State were met by resident clergy at Sacred Heart Church in Boone, Saints Peter and Paul Church in Gilbert, and St. Patrick's in Nevada. In March 1899, Father Henry Eckert at Saints Peter and Paul was commissioned by the Archbishop to raise funds and build a church in Ames to be a mission church of Gilbert, interestingly. Prior to its construction, the first 10 families met in the home of William Kincaid in Reed's Hall in downtown Ames. Father Eckert traveled to Ames and sought directions to the Kincaids. He hitched his horse to a post on Onondaga Street, and by chance or divine providence, Kincaid had hitched his horse to the same post. Kincaid took Eckert home with him, introduced him to 9 families the next day, and the plans to build were underway. 4 lots on Elm Street, just south of Lincoln, or just north of Lincoln Way, were purchased for $500. A frame church called the Church of the Good Shepherd was built. It was a white frame structure, 34 by 36 feet, and held 60 people. Heat came from a large wood-burning cast iron stove, and parishioners furnished the wood. In 1905, the frame church was sold to Bethesda Lutheran, and a brick church was built on the corner of Lincoln Way and Oak Street. The cornerstone was laid July 5th, 1906, for a 40 by 70 foot building that would seat 240 people. It cost between $11,000 and $13,000. The church was dedicated on November 26, 1907, and renamed St. Cecilia Catholic Church. And St. Cecilia, in case you don't know, is the patron saint of musicians. Sunday school was established in 1907. There were 3 classes, 1 for juniors, 1 for seniors, and a 3rd perseverance class. And I have to admit, I don't know what that means. We could maybe imagine, though. A Catholic Truth and Total Abstinence Society was initiated to make St. Cecilia's an aggressive force for morality. In 1908, trustees bought 5 acres for a cemetery located northeast of the city. But in 1930, plans were developed for a municipal cemetery at Maxwell and 9th Street. So in 1933, St. Cecilia's deeded their 5 acres to the city for $1. In exchange, the city agreed to provide lots of equal size in the new cemetery and to move all the burials, tombstones, and markers at no charge. The Calvary section bordering 13th Street in the cemetery is generally considered to be the Catholic section. Those 5 acres of the former cemetery were held by the city for 21 years and then sold to Reinhard Friedrich for $4,500. In 1957, development began on those 5 acres. In 1914, the church was enlarged and St. Cecilia and Saints Peter and Paul parishes separated. On September 7th, 1925, a school was established by St. Cecilia's just north of the church on Oak Street. It cost $30,000 and was staffed by the Sisters of Mercy, a teaching order of nuns. A 1960 addition accommodated growth. As time went on, the congregation grew and the church began to develop structural problems that could not be easily repaired. The parish council made the decision to sell the property with the proceeds used to construct a new church, convent, and school on property at 30th and Hoover. The Lincoln Way property that included the church, the convent, a rectory, and eventually the school and playground was sold to the state of Iowa for use by the Department of Transportation. September 29th, 1974 marked the final mass at the Lincoln Way Church. Their third church was constructed at 30th and Hoover and dedicated in 1972. The following year, the rectory and administration center were built, and groundbreaking for the social center was in 1986. A new education center built at the Hoover site in 1995 marked the end of 23 years of divided parish facilities. The old school continued in use until the new one was built. The cement plaque that was over the school's main entrance on Oak Street was removed and is now at the new education center. Noted sculptor Christian Peterson attended St. Cecilia's and created a sculpture group for the parish, Madonna of the Schools. It was moved to the Hoover site and still remains there. The parish has 4 other small Christian Peterson sculptures. Peterson's best-known work is the Four Seasons Fountain in front of the Memorial Union at Iowa State. And of course, we know that within the next year, the final structures from St. Cecilia's Parish, the school and the former convent, will be demolished to make way for the new aquatic center. Okay, going back in time again, 1905, we're going to talk about Bethesda Lutheran. As an immigrant church, Bethesda Lutheran shares a history with many congregations in America. People arrived in Ames, in America, with great hope and deep faith, and the congregations that were founded in the early 1900s looked and sounded like congregations from the homelands. Bethesda's founders were mostly Norwegian. Services and Sunday school were conducted in Norwegian until 1923, and the church remains locally famous for its annual Scandinavian coffee. In 1905, the first constitution was adopted. In the postcard that I'm showing you on the screen here, the Norwegian Lutheran Church, which was, again, the former Catholic Church, is seen in the background in this view from Lincoln Way of St. Cecilia Catholic Church and Rectory. Can you all see that little spire poking up there? In an interesting footnote, the Bethesda Church, the former Catholic Church, appears in this rare photo of the house that the former Hoggett School became a part of at 1008 3rd Street. It was a significant clue to Farwell Brown as to the whereabouts of the little former school structure that was rediscovered, moved, and restored. I think Farwell must have been really sharp to recognize the spire of that church. There it is, and there it is. So I guess it was pretty recognizable. But this map is really a good one. You can see Lincoln Way and the new St. Cecilia Church there on the corner, and then just the block down, their former church, and then the Bethesda Church. Okay, now let me find my place. The Lutheran congregation worshipped at the White Frame Church until 1928, when they purchased property and built their first sanctuary at Kellogg and 7th Street. The new church was built in phases. First, the lower level was finished and roofed. The slanted roof that moved water away from the structure later became the slanted floor of the sanctuary. When the congregation could afford it, the sanctuary was built atop the lower level. The interior is finished in a very Scandinavian wood stick style. A larger campus was needed as the congregation grew, and in 1961, property was purchased for the current site at Northwestern and 16th Street. Some church members were unhappy, though, that the church would move so far away and chose to stay at the old site, establishing themselves as Ascension Lutheran Church. After the dedication of the new facility, Bethesda helped to establish the Beloit Children's Home, the Iowa State Lutheran Campus Student Center, and St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. At the Northwestern Avenue Church is a food pantry, clothing closet, reading and tutoring services, and space for use by other community organizations. And they partner with other congregations in supporting the Good Neighbor and Home for a While programs. In 2011, Bethesda installed geothermal heating and cooling that leaves a much smaller carbon footprint, an effort to save the planet for future generations. Okay, now we're zigzagging back in time again, 1911. We're going to talk about Collegiate Presbyterian Church. This statement appeared in a 1911 local paper article. Quote, "The recent entry into Ames of several Presbyterians devoted to the church has brought about the new organization. Heretofore, Presbyterians have come and after a short season of looking around, have either united with other denominations or have retained possession of their letters. But the new kind to enter Ames society are of the Scotch variety, who are Presbyterians till they die, who've been baptized in the Presbyterian faith and stay on the Presbyterian side. The Presbyterian church is tenacious. It hangs on to a man like grim death." Good Lord. "If we can get a chance at these students and salvation-free professors, we will straighten them out and make churchgoers out of them. Our church does not come to make war, but to bring peace." Wow. No, unquote. That was in the paper. Collegiate Presbyterian was founded in February 1911 when 30 members met at Tom Sloss's house, and Tom was the college's physical plant manager. The Synod of Iowa envisioned a church that would minister to the State College and the greater Ames community. The idea of serving both town and gown in a single congregation was innovative at the time. Although the church had no building in 1911, it did own land and a house at the college's west gate, the southwest corner of Sheldon and West Streets. During 1911, the church met for a time at the Sloss House and then at the chapel in Alumni Hall, though this stopped because other churches objected to the use of state property by one denomination. So the congregation bought a tent, pitched it on their lot, and met there until the cold weather came. The next move was to a dance hall over Champlin's Grocery at the southeast corner of Lincoln Way and Welch Avenue. Worshiping there every Sunday for 5 years, the congregation did its best to keep right side up on folding chairs placed on the highly waxed dance floor. More than 200. By 1914, a second pastor was added to the staff, one college pastor and one community pastor. In November 1914, a statewide campaign secured $50,000 for a church building and religious center, particularly for the more than 500 Presbyterian students attending Iowa State. President Raymond Pearson and other college faculty attended a campaign dinner And Ames Mayor Parley Sheldon announced that Reverend Billy Sunday, the famous evangelist, had sent his check for $500. The original church building, which is the present sanctuary, was dedicated in December 1917 for 400 members. College Presbyterian was a grand experiment in 1911 with a unique calling to be a combination student and community church. The December 13th, 1917 Ames Tribune reported, quote, "The dedication of the new Collegiate Presbyterian Church placed another handsome structure in the city for public use. The large crowd expressed their admiration for the beauty of the architecture both inside and out. The cost of the work was about $80,000. Citizens across the state contributed $68,000, and the balance was provided by 1,200 local subscribers. In 1919, the Westminster Foundation was established to oversee the college student ministry. In 1923, the church sent its first missionaries to Brazil, and since then has supported projects in Liberia, Kenya, and the Philippines. Beginning in the 1950s, the church assisted international Iowa State students from 12 countries. In the 1950s and again in the 1980s, Collegiate sponsored several refugee families, helping them settle in Ames. The church housed Hope Preschool for many years and assisted Story County Housing, Youth and Shelter Services, Good Neighbor Emergency Assistance, the Emergency Residence Project, Free Medical Clinic, Center for Creative Justice, and many other services. From 1947 to 2018, the Presbyterian Women's Association supported mission work from the proceeds of their very famous semi-annual rummage sales. Those were great sales. Collegiate's first edition, the West Wing, was completed in 1952. It housed the campus ministry activities, Christian education program, a library, and choir room. In 1959, the new South Wing housed church offices, education rooms, the Sarah Barlow Fellowship Lounge, campus ministry offices and programs, and the Helzer Chapel. 60s, Collegiate was offering 3 worship services and installing closed-circuit television in Helzer Chapel to accommodate the growing number of worshipers. In 1975, Collegiate completed a major renovation of the sanctuary. The chancel was relocated from the west end of the sanctuary to the east end. The east balcony was removed and the east windows were colorfully reglazed to become the focal point of the remodeled sanctuary. At the west end, the former chancel platform, choir loft, and organ console were removed to accommodate seating. A new west balcony was built for the choir and organ. The decorative backs of the elders' chairs retained from the original chancel were incorporated into the balcony railing. Some church members were extremely unhappy with this change, and this contributed to their departing Collegiate and working with others to establish Northminster Presbyterian on 24th Street. Kind of similar to what happened with Bethesda and Ascension. An elevator installed in 1984 made the 7 levels of Collegiate Presbyterian accessible to all. Okay, now we're back to 1916. Again, we're going to talk about Collegiate Methodist. In fall 1912, the Iowa Methodist Interconference Commission met to consider a proposal by Reverend Elias Handy that a pastor to students be placed in each of our state schools. The next year, Reverend William Hintz was appointed as pastor to the students at Ames. His headquarters were at First Methodist Church downtown, 2 miles from campus, though the Bible study classes and fellowship groups were held on campus in Alumni Hall. The year 1916 marked the beginning of formal church activity by Methodists in the university community. Second floor rental space, again in the Champlin building at the corner of Lincoln Way and Welch, was secured when it was vacated by the Presbyterians. Moving in, moving out. The cost was $5 per month during the summer and $10 during the winter. On August 12th, 1916, Reverend William Hintz, the pastor to students, reported that there were 77 families in the college area who were Methodist by membership or by preference. So in September 1916, the Campus Methodist Church was organized. Reverend Hintz continued to remind the Methodist Commission of the great need for a church and student center near campus. In 1917, the Wesley Foundation of Iowa was incorporated, providing financial support to the campus ministry from all the Methodist churches in Iowa. In November 1918, Proudfoot, Bird, and Rawson were secured as architects for a church consisting of 3 parts: a social unit, an educational unit, and a chapel. Proudfoot, Bird, and Rawson were the preeminent architects of the era, who had also designed the Memorial Union and a number of other buildings on campus, as well as the Sheldon Munn Hotel in downtown Ames. Construction began, contractors began the construction of a temporary 1-story building on the completed foundation of the social unit with a 40 by 60-foot addition to the rear. This temporary building, officially designated as Wesley Hall, but generally referred to as the Shack, was opened in January 1921. The building was one of the most popular places at the university, used by the Wesley Foundation and in demand by such organizations as the Faculty Women's Club and the Cosmopolitan Club for international students. The current sanctuary was dedicated in June 1926 with the temporary shack providing educational and fellowship space until the south and west wings were completed in 1955 and 1956. Iowa State was the second campus in the country to have a Methodist student program. To this day, the Wesley Foundation at ISU continues to be one of only 2 Wesley Foundations in the United States that shares building and staff with a local congregation. So, the spiritual life of our town has continued to diversify and expand, with representative groups from the world's other great religions now present in our community. It seems in many ways that there is a spiritual home for just about everyone. In addition to ministering to congregations, the people of our churches have provided a wealth of services and programs to the community, making our town a more inclusive and caring place. So I thank you, and that's the end. Now, Kathy mentioned at the beginning that if you have questions, comments, or corrections to the script, raise your hand and we'll run a microphone over. Are there any comments or questions? Yeah, Peter. Whoop, hang on just a second.
You mentioned that Bethesda became Ascension, or the building became
Right.
Ascension. But after Ascension moved out, it's now an Orthodox church.
Right.
So the continued evolution.
I know it, the buildings keep getting handed, and, you know, it was understandable in the early years when a building was very precious, but it continues to this day, especially with that. I was really delighted when that congregation took over Ascension and continued it as a church. It is so beautiful on the inside. Thanks, Peter. Questions, comments, corrections?
My understanding is that at First United Methodist, the wall that would go up into the top
Yeah.
is still up there.
Oh, is
They
it?
just don't bring it down anymore.
Oh, my goodness.
I just asked about that last week. I haven't been up. I don't climb up there, but I know where the door is to go up there, but I don't go up there. But yeah, it's up there.
Susan, ask around and I will amend the script.
But it's up there if you want to come over and look sometime. Look, you can climb up and look.
Hang from the ceiling and take a look.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's
Thank you for that.
yeah. You don't have to actually hang from the ceiling, but you need a ladder.
But I think just the whole design of that church, it was so thoughtful. You know, they were thinking about conserving heat. They were thinking of, you know, the curvature of the pews.
They also
Yeah,
closed the west entrance that faces the post office.
Yeah,
During the Depression, they built a wooden, what do I say, wall, to block the cold air from coming into that west entrance, because that was the main entrance at that
course.
time.
of course.
We have pictures of that, and it's pretty, it doesn't look too great. But these women had their big heavy fur coats on and stuff standing in front of this shabby looking wooden door, but there you go. It kept the cold out.
Kept the cold out. Very, very economical, very economical. Other questions, comments?
Did you have to go to the churches and crawl through their dusty archives to get all this information?
The History Museum has a certain amount of that information, but happily in the days of the internet, most of these churches, because they have such deep history in our town, have included history on their websites. So other than kind of traveling around and getting updated pictures of the current buildings, I was able to sit at home and compile quite a bit of this information. Yeah.
Kathy, you had 10 churches. Can you recall the first and last one in the group? Was your initial display in chronological order?
Yes, it was.
So the last one in your presentation would be the one at the bottom.
Right,
Okay.
right.
And is it fair to say that there were churches, other churches not in the presentation being built during that time, or did you get the ones that really mattered, or how did you select?
Roger, as far as I know, these were the 10 existing churches between 1850 and 1916, as far as I know. Is there a Friends group?
There was the Friends Church at Pike and Boone, or Lincoln Way and Sheldon,
Okay,
that existed for about 12 years, I think, or so. But it went away.
it went away. Do you know what time period those 12 years were?
It was right before the turn of the century.
Hmm.
I think it lasted past 1900, but not far, maybe 1902 it closed or something.
Well, thank you for that. I guess in an amended script, I better add it.
I also wanted to just mention that Collegiate Presbyterian, right after it opened, was the flu epidemic, and it served as a overflow for state gym for flu patients. So
Wow. Thank you for that. That is a very interesting piece of information to add.
Somebody have their hand up over here or something?
I have
Oh, yeah.
Going back to First Methodist, some of the pictures you notice, like the one of the Christian church over there where Matison's was, and you
Yeah.
could see through.
Yeah.
On top of the dome, it used to look like a cross. They had on the spire that goes up, there was a ring around it so that it looked like a cross from anywhere in the city.
Oh,
But I don't know what happened. It broke or came down or something. So we've talked, some of us have talked about putting that back up, but I think it's not worth the money that it would take to fix it. But it's interesting that you could see then the cross everywhere because it was circular.
I'll be darned. Neat. Seeing no other questions? I thank you so much for coming, and we're a little longer than usual tonight, but thank you for staying.